Is Levia good? From her release in 2021 all the way up to before Dusk Till Dawn in 2023, that answer was pretty clearly no. And yet for certain pockets of the Flesh and Blood community, she was our ride or die, but we couldn't clearly answer that question either. Is she good? Well, she was fun, she was thematic, she was addicting, and she could be good, but she was lacking. Then came Dusk Till Dawn, a supplemental Flesh and Blood set that gave us the first Shadow Brute cards since Monarch. With 3 months of Dusk Till Dawn play experience and a slew of events to look back on, let's try answering that question again. Is Levia good? Real quick before we jump into today's video, there is a sponsor to thank, and that is IntotheAM. They're a fantastic company led by a bunch of artists who put their unique designs right on high quality t-shirts and other apparel. As someone who's a big fan of graphic tees, I was really excited to get my order in, and you actually can with an additional 10% discount code that you can find in the description and in the comments below. I did have to put these t-shirts to the ringer though, just to make sure that they were completely up to snuff, not for me, but also for the whole household. Let's take a look. Oh, Mori, you are so soft, but I don't think you're the softest thing in the house anymore. Oh man, that's what I'm talking about. 60% cotton, 40% polyester, terrific print quality. Now that's the good stuff, even if you did get some of your hairs on the shirt. All right, Razzle, what do you think? I know you're a big fan of your enclosure here. I put a lot of work into it, but I've got a new environment you might enjoy. Oh, look at you, Razzle, you're right at home. Basking in that white sand feel. I know I'm enjoying it. And that's no joke. All I took with me to US Nationals was a couple full outfits brought to you by IntotheAM, and it was a great weekend of comfort and compliments on the t-shirts. So if you're interested at all, please use the link in the comments and description for 10% off. Thank you once again to IntotheAM. Rah, my Ram Raiders, it's Mansant, and we're back with a deeper dive discussion video, really trying to answer the age-old question, is Levia good? Now, funny enough, even with a clear injection of support in Dusk Till Dawn, the community perception of Levia is still all over the place. Even the devoted players in the League of Levia are waffling constantly. Is she good? Did she get better? Is she still lacking? So today we're going to take it to the books and look at actual results and changes in community perception, the card quality, ups and downs, strengths and weaknesses of this hero to try to answer this question for everybody and of course give my very unbiased opinion. So let's remember real quick what Levia looked like pre-Dusk Till Dawn, and that was a hero with a pretty black and white identity. She was a Shadow Brute whose unique mechanic over Rhinar let her play these tall attacks without the discard cost that was normally associated with the vanilla Brute package. Because she banished from graveyard instead of discarding from hand, that meant she could actually push more aggressive rates out of a Brute deck all of a sudden, which put her in this aggressive slanted role, more so because when she started playing in these Blood Debt cards, she had to continuously turn off Blood Debt, which really had no payoff. You were ramping up to basically summon Doomsday or perhaps swing Hexagore, but that was about it. So you had a Brute hero that could push better numbers than Rhinar, but couldn't intimidate to the same degree as Rhinar, and that left her quite honestly kind of at the bottom of everyone's tier list. She didn't do anything uniquely well, and she really struggled because there was no clear benefit towards playing into this potentially game-losing mechanic with Blood Debt. Pre-Dusk Till Dawn, her stats were very, very rough to look at. Coming from Talishar, which of course take with a grain of salt, but it is a great way to just look at tons of games played. If you look at where Levia was right before Dusk Till Dawn, coming from June of this year, with over 3,000 games played, she was rocking that wonderful 34% win rate, with her best matchup in the game being the mirror match right at a 50%. Now, even as a devoted Levia player putting tons of reps into this hero, I actually also struggled maintaining a consistent win rate with Levia. You could definitely have games that felt really good, but crossing the finish line every time and pulling off the games that felt like assured victories early was just never a given because of how she could fall to her own inconsistencies and not really get payoff for playing into the heavy Blood Debt. That said, she still had her core strengths of playing into Recursion, which was particularly strong when Fatigue Oldhim was a thing. She still is a very strong deck at maintaining high-value trade cycles where you block with some cards, play out some cards, and kind of go above rate of the baseline 12 that you expect out of that. And then, of course, she has a little bit of an advantage over Rhinar as a Brute of pushing Blood Rush Bellows to new highs with easier access to cheaper Brute attacks, But then came Dusk Till Dawn, and Dusk Till Dawn, of course, injected a lot of power. It added over 30 cards directly into this Shadow Brute that we hadn't got support for in almost 2 years. Now, of course, the big reveal coming from the Dusk Till Dawn was the inclusion of a new demi-hero for Levia in Levia Redeemed and Blasphemfet Levia Consumed. This alone warped the entire playstyle of Levia going forward, because now with this triggered ability in your inventory, you got to now play with guaranteed payoff to some degree of playing into Blood Debt, whether you flip into Blasphemfet Levia Consumed for this effective extra hand of Blood Debt cards you get to play, or healing yourself a bit with Levia Redeemed and stabilizing an incredibly strong late game. All of a sudden, we got it. We got the reward that we were looking for playing into Blood Debt. It just took 2 years to get there. On top of that, there were also new cards like Spoiled Skull given to us that just fleshed out more of our equipment suite. Strangely enough, one of the things that Levia players had complained about a lot pre-Dusk Till Dawn was the awkwardness of her Majestics overall. Levia had some pretty mild Majestics when you look at the power level of, say, Mark of the Beast versus another Majestic like Swarming Gloomveil, right? So Levia's Majestics never really gave her too much of an identity. So much of her power was in her commons and her rares like Dread Screamer and Endless Maw. So the Levia community definitely asked a lot for more unique Majestics. Let's see what happens when we finally get a dump of new Majestics. And Dusk Till Dawn did deliver in that, with some really interesting design space in the Majestic slots in particular, that being Slithering Shadowpede, which is an incredible new addition into the one cost space that Levia really loves, along with having amazing synergy with Art of War, right? At the cost of being a red non-block. Sure, we can't have it all, us brutes. Also with some more off-the-wall inclusions like Shade and Death Hydra, which on paper look fantastic and yet on the table are still trying to find their home. And then cards like Blood Dripping Frenzy, which allude to future design spaces as well, with potentially new Shadow-style claws that could make this its own version of Blood Rush Bellow, or just slamming it into current decks and hoping to get a little bit lucky to get its full payoff. Contrary to what we said about the power level of the commons and rares Levia had pre-Dusk Till Dawn, well, Dusk Till Dawn gave us a really awkward common and rare slot pretty much across the board for the set, which honestly is a little bit disheartening, because I was hoping to see the design space of Levia continue in this direction of, very obviously, as far as Flesh and Blood math goes, above rate attacks at the cost of banishing, at the cost of needing to manage your graveyard. But instead, we got these commons and rares that are pretty much copy-paste versions of the vanilla brute cards like Breakneck Battery to Ram Raider or Primeval Bellow to Shade and Scream. They're the exact same effects, except you swap the discard cost for a random banish from hand, which is really awkward across the board. I don't think that many people in the Levia community were too happy with these cards, because they tend to backpedal a bit with the power level we saw at the cost of Blood Debt, right? So it kind of puts us in an awkward spot of trying to understand where the developers are at with Levia. They gave us these not above rate cards, and yet they're tied to banishing and tied to Blood Debt, which is supposed to be a bit of a punishing mechanic. So if we're not getting any payoff for being above rate anymore, does that mean Levia's identity is now tied to just kind of the demi-hero? That's her unique trait, and she's no longer going to be given these above rate plays anymore. It's a little frightening. I don't love it. There are some use cases for these, like Shade and Scream actually being decent in a Hexcore deck, or Ram Raider being a good enough rate next to Slithering Shadowpede, but overall this was definitely a bit of a miss in the Dusk Till Dawn set for us Levia players. With all these new cards in the game though, if we take a look at the most recent month's data from Talishar, Levia climbed 10 percentage points, baby, all the way up to 44%, which with 14,000 games played, 44%, obviously there was an uptick in player interest in Levia. We're going to give benefit of the doubt. I think a lot of these people are still new, just testing the hero, a bit of a flavor of the month still, but to go up from 34% to 44% is still definitely significant. More than just that, we can actually look at some of the matchups now and see where her strengths lie, because of the consistency piece that was added in having the demi-hero always as an option now, flipping into Consumed with the Blood Debt trigger, or manually flipping over into Redeemed. Even just open to the general public, she clearly is having better matchups into, let's say, Dash, Dromai, Rhinar, unfortunately new Prism, but I wouldn't really read into this too much. This is just to give an impression of what it looked like before for the general public to now. Overall, her strengths are still very similar to the way they were before, but of course now added to this blood debt payoff that we can always play towards in a given Levia game because of the Demi Hero. It feels a lot better to play those games that I mentioned prior, where you felt like you were playing your game well and then things just fell apart. Now there's so much more security and actual agency towards playing into safety nets you have later on in the game. Flipping into consumed means you don't actually have to worry about taking blood debt anymore at another point in the game. That's huge. So you make one good choice in the middle and you can actually get rewarded further in the game. It's fantastic. As far as weaknesses go, there are still the problems of inconsistencies, the fact that she doesn't have hit effects to really force interaction, and now the fact that she has to play around her own thresholds of flipping into 13 for consumed. That is something that players now can actually try to interrupt. Tipping you past a certain threshold, or even trying to block you out post a consume flip to get you to mill out and lose. There are new ways to interrupt what a Levia is trying to do to win, but I'll take the strengths over the newly added weakness any day because Dusk Till Dawn really was a huge boon. Now, Levia has some established strengths that I think most of the community is pretty aware of by now, and that is the fact that she can play into a recursion package, which is a really consistent way to never lose damage. As you draw up new hands, you're really only looking for resources and one Banisher enabler to kickstart an engine of either Howl from Beyond's, Deep-Rooted Evils, whatever it is, to just dump damage on your opponent and really not lose the tempo game that way and add some graveyard control to your entire game plan. It's a very strong way to play Levia, and something that you can normally ramp into by naturally finding your recursion pieces and getting them where you want, or try to turbo into with awful cards like Shadow of Blasphemfet. Recursion remains a really strong piece of how Levia plays, even if you don't need it in every game because of how consumed kind of restricts what you can play out of Blood Debt anyway. Of course, she also has access to an insane chest piece in Carrion Husk, which is now more relevant than ever because almost every deck is packing at least CNC to get great value out of your Carrion Husk. And then you've got your well-statted original release cards like Endless Maw, Dread Screamer, Boneyard Marauder. Those are just such a strong core of what makes Levia worth playing to begin with. And then, of course, the new Demi Hero, which is an added depth, which I don't think anyone has quite reached yet in terms of playing to perfectly, knowing when to give up flipping into consumed for a redeemed game plan, or what amount of blood debt you're really comfortable taking because consumed is such a guaranteed win. It's a very complex card, but is a very obviously strong card as well, because it pretty much just says you get to make a lot more choices now, you have a lot more agency over your own game, and hopefully your own fate, which is just not something that Levia had prior. There are still some remaining questions in the older card pool, along with some of the newer card pool, that the community is still all over the place with, and that is how aggressive is Levia really supposed to be right now with cards like Wild Ride. And side story here, when I met one of the devs for Flesh and Blood at Worlds, I was advised to pay special attention to Skullcrack in Levia lists because of how strong that card was into pushing a more consistent aggro-oriented brute. I still have huge questions on those fronts myself. I'm not very convinced with Skullcrack. I also am downright terrified of too many red non-blocks, especially when you have Pulping and Wild Ride. Together, they all cost 2. What do you do when you draw them all? Those are still problems to solve. Those are still questions a little unanswered. And then you've got newer cards like Diabolic Offering and Shaden Death Hydra, which don't have an exact home in current Levia lists, even though they should feel quite strong. You look at Diabolic Offering and see basically a blue Graveling Growl with potentially an even higher ceiling of blocking 6. In a blue slot where you had a lot of flexibility there anyway. It seems like an incredible card, but the more you play with it, the less you actually want it in your list. Same deal with Shaden Death Hydra. On paper, it looks incredibly strong. This should have a role in almost every game, but it doesn't really come up and feels a lot like filler. So then here's another question. Is Levia good in terms of her gameplay? Well, pretty obviously, Levia has strengths that you can't ignore because raw numbers alone, she can just dump damage on the table, and that's really off the back of how well she uses Bloodrush Bellows. Bloodrush Bellows still being probably the best brute card in the game, but Levia uses it to a different degree where you're not just looking to get a claw attack off, you have easier access into potentially going 4 wide, with slamming a Dread Screamer into a new 1-cost attack to top it off, to come in for 26 damage. You can do this more easily now with even consumed, right? Pull in that Graveling Growl, pull in that Dread Screamer, whatever it is, that you need to push Blood Rush Bellows to new heights. It's incredible because one of the axes that any aggressive deck in Flesh and Blood needs to be able to overcome is getting over the baseline block value of a hand, right? If all you're doing is 12 damage, your opponent can just kind of stop you if they want. But Blood Rush Bellows baseline lets you push about 6 over, potentially 8 over, of course catch your opponent in weird situations, and they just end up eating tons and tons and tons of damage. And Blood Rush Bellows definitely is the best card in your deck, but you're doing damage off the back of many other cards in Levia as well. So it's not the only thing you're playing for, but it's definitely the strongest play, and one of the things that Levia can absolutely abuse over Rhinar. Then, of course, like I mentioned before, Levia's trading patterns are really strong because of how well she operates off of one blue hand, using that blue resource card to either pay for Dread Screamer into a Graveling Growl, a 3-card 13, paying for an Endless Maw, a 2-card 9, and you're gaining value on the sides of that because of what you blocked with to maintain a healthier graveyard, what you're putting in Arsenal to smooth out your future gameplay lines. Her curve is really solid, and it doesn't ask too much in terms of combos. You know, you're looking for a 2-card pair, Endless Maw and a blue, a 3-card pair, Dread Graveling blue. In terms of what Dusk added to this incredibly strong core, you actually have a new insane line with Art of War and a blue and Slithering Shadowpeed. This is a 3-card combo, and only Art of War can be the piece that's parked in Arsenal because it won't work if that's where Slithering Shadowpeed is. But you get to play Art of War banishing Slithering Shadowpeed, naming Go Again, and draw a card. So you banish Slithering Shadowpeed. Now all of a sudden, you've got 2 floating, you're guaranteed to be playing Slithering Shadowpeed as one of your action points. If you draw a 1-cost off of the 2 draw on the Art of War, then you're effectively playing a 2-card 12 or 13. You're playing out the Slithering, you're playing out the 1-cost, and then that extra card that you would have had off the Art of War draw is going into your arsenal. So you need 3 cards to kickstart the play, but then you end up keeping a card as well. So it's a 2-card 12 or 13, which is insane. I mean, that's a new high for Levia. A 2-card 9 was something, and now you're effectively playing with a 2-card 13 at times. A little bit of luck required for this one, but that is where the strengths of Levia do continue to shine. Dusk didn't ignore completely on that front and did add to this above rate curve that she can consistently pull off, on top of Slithering and Art of War already being cards that you want in the deck. There's also now more than ever skill expression available to us as Levia pilots, and some of them we've learned over these past few years. It's the small stuff. It's making the choices like blocking with a blue Wrecker Romp over a non-blue 6 just to maintain the ratios of your graveyard. It's selecting to go first so that you can get a little bit of extra graveyard fill, hopefully for free, and not be punished for going second and having nothing to do. It's smart equipment blocking. Sure, all those pieces are definitely there, but now there are added windows, which like I mentioned before, don't think anyone's truly mastered yet in terms of using cards with very, very impactful once per game effects like Scowling Fleshbag. This card I don't think you use in every matchup, but this ability to block and intimidate a card out of your opponent's hand has so many factors that lead into it, because you first and foremost also need to make the decision on when you want this card engraved. Is that going to force a play more than any other choice? What is it doing to disrupt your opponent? That's another choice you have to weigh. What is it doing early game when you know your opponent is going to have room to arsenal that card and just play it later anyway, versus saving until the extreme late game so that when you intimidate a card and your opponent gets stuck with it in arsenal, will they have a chance to play it out? There's a lot of depth, a lot of freaking depth to playing Scowling Fleshbag. The Demi-Hero, like I mentioned before, a lot to explore in getting perfect use out of the Demi-Hero. How much blood debt do you want to take to flip? Are you actually playing overwhelmingly defensive because you're trying to get specific cards in your banish before you flip? Are you tutoring out targets that you want to play later with Shadow Blastfight instead of just recursion pieces? There's such an insane ceiling to how to play the Demi-Hero correctly, and like most of choices in Levia, it's also insanely contextual. So as for the gameplay itself, there's a huge decision to be made every game that really changes how your entire game plan is going to play out, and that is in sideboarding. Are you going to play into recursion or are you not? And this choice is still very, very tough to make. It's not only tied to just matchups where you think pretty obviously in the old days when you were versus an Oldhim, you just take in recursion. It's that simple. Now we're getting to a point where it's a lot more nuanced in a Dromai could slow down, but they don't have to. A Bravo could slow down, but they don't have to. And those choices now put a lot of onus on you as the Levia player to not only understand the matchup in and out, but also understand your opponent's tendencies and how they're going to play the matchup, how much they understand about playing into Levia, where you think they will try to attack the game from. And that has made this choice more stressful than ever before in my experience playing Levia. So recursion aside, let's look at how Levia wants to play an early game, and that is really to accomplish a couple goals. First and foremost, you want to be filling graveyard proactively rather than banishing immediately. And that's because if you figure you banish your first 3 cards from graveyard when you have exactly 3, means you're only filling the graveyard now with 1 new card, you banish 3, you're in a position now where you're hoping your opponent lets you block with 2 cards, and then you spend 2 cards to do the exact same play. You banish 3, leave 1, block 2 cards, banish 3, leave 1, block 2 cards. Your opponent has a lot of agency to interrupt that, and if you're playing that tight early game, then all of a sudden if they take an off turn, you probably have not had room to reset your arsenal in a way that you want, and you just take Blood Debt out of nowhere. It's a way your opponent can all of a sudden trip you up. You don't want to take the bait most of the time, so what you're trying to do is get graveyard fill going with cards like Pulping, or Swing Big, or Command and Conquer, things that don't tax your graveyard. That's step number 1. You also definitely want to maintain pressure in some capacity. Levia will ramp up into a really strong mid game when you can finally put some small hand combos together, so playing completely passively, like blocking 4 cards, isn't really going to help you when you finally want to take tempo. You'll have been leaking damage and then are asking a lot from your deck to have good turn into good turn into good turn. So you want to take those turns like Swing Big whenever you see them. Lastly, you want to set yourself up for Bloodrush Bellows to be your tempo taker, and Boneyard Marauder in Arsenal is the strongest way to do that. Your Arsenal Boneyard Marauder, or actually even Slithering Centipede these days if you haven't played into Blood Debt, and now you're looking at the wonderful 3-card 18 that Levia is able to pull off with Bloodrush, leading with blue, drawing into a blue, paying for Claw, Boneyard, arsenaling the next card. It's a way to kickstart not only card advantage, but a above rate turn into you playing the tempo game and having more agency over how your hands line up because you're ahead on Arsenal as well. It's one of the strongest and most consistent things you can do to set yourself up for a strong pivot into the mid game, so that's always one of my number 1 goals. So then we look into the mid game plays with Levia, and generally this is about when you start to play into Blood Debt pretty consistently turn after turn. You may have taken an early banish and then ignored maybe 1 or 2 Blood Debt tick, but the mid game is when you really are looking to play your aggressive hands, slam every Endless Maw you see, slam every Dread Screamer you see, always be the aggressor, take no more off turns. And this is when you can really use your life as a resource to decide, I'm going to take every Art of War hand, I'm going to take every Blood Rush hand I see, because I need this damage out of my deck, I can't afford to pitch these yellows in. So the mid game is generally where you play most like a brute, and you say no blocks for a lot of hands and just try to slam your opponent with damage, because Levia really wants to be the one who presents lethal first. I think every deck obviously wants to do this, but Levia is in a position where, because you don't have a lot of hit effects, you're trading that off for hopefully above rate damage if your hands line up. So you play your early game well, you transition in mid game, you present lethal, and then can get into this grindy state with your opponent where you actually don't mind trading down cards. You've been doing that all game anyway, but your opponent's deck maybe isn't built to trade, and now you get the advantage when playing off smaller card hands. One of the new things that's come up in flipping to Blazafet Levia Consumed in almost every game, I'd say, Redeemed is definitely there, but it's consumed most of the time, is the idea of flipping into a turn where tempo is still in your court. And this is because if you flip to Blazafet Levia Consumed and do nothing with your turn, full block, flip, you are now guaranteed to be at 13 life, right? And this is a game where generally you and your opponent will trade very equal life totals. So let's assume your opponent is around 13, you flip guaranteed to 13, but you didn't present anything. You just gave your opponent room to slam you with your hand. Now you did gain an intellect bonus by now being able to play out of your banish zone, but you won't generally force every card out of your opponent's hand with them at around 13. You might demand a 1-card block. You might push them in a little bit of an awkward state, but unless you drew specifically a Blood Rush hand on like that first turn post-flip, then your opponent probably has about 2 turns where they can ignore you and try to make you still block out and put pressure on Levia. Even in a world where you don't need to turn off Blood Debt, it's a world where non-blocks can still kill you. So how do you get around that? Well, one of the best things you can do is try to flip into Blazafet Consumed with an impactful play that just doesn't turn off Blood Debt. So cards like Command and Conquer, which you will normally run into Aggro and Lexi anyway, or Swing Big, which is a staple for the deck, those cards are really strong now to actually want to set up an arsenal when you get to the consumed phase of that mid-game, which is not something you would ever do prior. Arsenaling a swing big, arsenaling a command and conquer normally meant your arsenal is now not a way to turn off blood debt. That's a big risk. But now you actually want that. You can look for a later stage swing big or command and conquer to be your guaranteed way of flipping to consumed with tempo, and that's massive. If you can pull that off, then flipping to consumed really makes it feel like you are an unbeatable behemoth and get to just barrel through your opponent, because now they had to answer a question into you becoming an obviously stronger hero, and there's no back foot to play off of. It's incredibly strong. Then we get to what a late game for Levia looks like, and I will say, oh my gosh, you get to play so many real late games now that aren't just, oh, you made me block out, I just take blood debt and die. Luckily, those scenarios are fewer and far between, which is a huge boon for the hero, but there's still the issue with Levia of how do you close the game, because you might play a really strong early game, really strong mid game, but if you teeter out and just don't draw, go again, don't draw away to go above your opponent's blocks, then even with consumed, you have this additional lose con of potentially milling yourself out. So one of the ways to make sure that a late game goes in your favor is by establishing a final blood rush push when life totals are low. A blood rush bellows will on average push 6 damage over the top, because you're going to present around 18 when your opponent should only be able to block 12. So a final blood rush push, even if it's not the full 6 and it's only like 4 over because it's a claw and attack, is a really strong way to go over blocks and just close out the game. The easier ways to get this done are with a Writhing Beast Hulk, which is starting to make its way back into the Levia list because it just says dominate. You know, we're playing this haymaker game. I'm taking damage, you're taking damage, I'm slogging big numbers, and then I'm just going to pull a Writhing Beast Hulk out of my consumed Banished Zone. Convulsions from the Bellows of Hell is a similar way to access Dominate and just make sure the game is over, because you get to pitch a blue for this, leave 1 floating for any Graveling Growl, Slithering Boneyard play you have, and then once again make your opponent answer a Dominate late in the game, where if you've been trading and both you and your opponent are off of Arsenal, then that's a really hard situation for them to bail themselves out of. And then finally, there's even the inevitability of Reckless Swing, which is honestly now more consistent than ever, because one of the things you had to juggle prior to Dusk Till Dawn with the Demi-Hero was turning off Blood Debt every turn meant you had to trade, you had to still attack. So you couldn't ever get your opponent to 2 and then just sit back, relax, and just know that you had the game win with some inevitability like a Rhinar might. But now with Consumed, and now especially if you go Redeemed, this card is so easy to close out games with because you get to now make new decisions around inevitability in your deck, which is something that, oh my god, Levia was never the inevitable hero. Inevitably, you probably lost to yourself, and now you can be in positions where you know your opponent's life threshold just means they die. It's another really strong way to close a game and something that you can genuinely play for now, which it never used to be. Then there's the Redeemed game plan, which is a little bit different because Redeemed doesn't actually change the way that your entire deck is going to function. The way that Consumed now lets you change all of your hand math because you can play out of your Banished Zone, but then puts you on a new game clock because you could mill yourself out. Levia Redeemed is very different in that all it's doing is turning off your Blood Debt and flipping your cards face down. So a couple things to note about that is when you flip to Redeemed, you're generally going to be in a longer game, and in a longer game, you want to have your recursion pieces in play. So you want to play out your recursion pieces before you flip into Redeemed. Once you do flip into Redeemed, though, similar to what I mentioned on the last slide, your game plan can change because you no longer have this inevitable lose con on your own end. You get to force those questions onto your opponent, and you can pivot game plan so drastically with Redeemed because there's not even that mill lose con like Consumed. I've had games with Redeemed where my opponent just can't attack me because they're at 2 and they know they died a Reckless, so I can now become the fatigue deck. I can just swing Mandible Claw every turn and they will deck out. There are some really funny situations with Redeemed, whether you actually get the heal out of it or not, or just make sure that you don't deal with Blood Debt for the rest of the game. I personally am a huge fan of Redeemed, but it's not quite the gameplay warping card like Consumed is. So those were Levia's strengths and game plans across the board and why she feels good to play, but there are true weaknesses still. And no, this is not me saying she's weak to Rhinar. Funny enough, I think that matchup's quite fine for her. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that she still isn't quite the best in slot at any particular game plan. Like Rhinar being able to make sure that turtle heroes don't get to play the game they want, intimidate full hands, deal true damage, that's still Reinar's MO into those game plans in a way that they really can't interact with. Levia feels fine into those kind of game plans because of recursion, but there isn't the same kind of inevitability like with Reinar because, yes, you're a lot more of a reliable deck now with the Demi-Hero, but things can still go wrong, like just not finding a recursion until the end of first cycle, or summoning Blasmfet and then getting a little too heavy-handed with Scab Skins and rolling ones into ones. Those are still ways that you can lose games where Reinar just doesn't have those scenarios in that kind of matchup. So all this to say, Levia still struggles at answering that question. What is she best at? Why play her over other decks? Is she actually the best aggro deck? No. Is she actually the best anti-fatigue deck? No. Is she the best deck at beating Dromai? No. Is she the best deck at beating Lexi? No. But can she play more as a jack of all trades and approach a tournament feeling like with good game knowledge and tight play, every matchup will be fair and will feel winnable? Levia's right there. I think you can definitely applaud Levia for being a jack of all trades hero that walks in and feels like there aren't any auto-lose matchups in the room. So if that's what you're trying to do, if you're not trying to target necessarily, but just have a deck that's going to play a fair game, Levia has that. But as far as card games go, that's not generally where decks succeed, unless her consistency was a little higher. Speaking of that consistency, let's take a really easy look at something that a Lexi player, for example, has to do when they deck build. They know that they want their cost curve to heavily feature zero-cost, strong hit effect arrows. They basically have limitless choices. They can add in Searing Shot, Endless Arrow, Bolted Shot, Pathing Helix even, and just have these cards that fit the cost curve that they want to draw and see every single turn. Levia doesn't exactly have that. She has what we pointed out before in those Dread Screamer plus Graveling plays, the Art of War plus Slithering, the Boneyard plus Blood Rush, but the problem with those plays is that you can't just fill your entire deck with cards that do the exact same thing and have consistent plays and cost curves where the only thing slightly changing are perhaps the text on the card. That's not where Levia lives. What changes on her end is quite literally the cost of the card, on top of needing to draw resources to supplement the fact that she can't just play purely redline, right? So consistency is always going to be a bit of a weakness in that regard because you can't just fill her entire deck with do the same thing. A lot of her hands are going to be highly varied, and because it is a random draw cycle, that first cycle through the deck, there will just be odd draws. There will be triple Blood Rush hands. Trust me, it happens. There's going to be Blood Rush draws that just hit double reds. There's going to be games where you see your deck in the wrong order, and those are just all things that lead to why Levia's consistency is just not quite there compared to a deck that just does the same thing every turn like Lexi or Fi. Another weakness Levia has is interaction points, and that's because she doesn't have any that really makes your opponent play off of their intended game plan other than swing big, and most people just ignore that one anyway. So what you're doing is trying to play to your best cost curve, while your opponent is just going to play to exactly whatever game plan they want to play out, since the only thing you ever ask of them is how much damage do they want to take. And so if your opponent's deck singing like a hummingbird and stinging like a bee, then there's nothing you can say about it. A Lexi deck that hits every Rain Razor's turn that they wanted to, that gains life advantage over you with 3 of a kind, that's constantly setting disruption pieces like Winter's Bite or Arctic Incarceration over and over again, will do everything that you can't. Play on curve and then also disrupt your curve. So it can be very frustrating as a Levia player that you just don't really get to ask those same questions out of your opponent. And finally, as we see other card pools get fleshed out, every class is now kind of given their big disruption point, and Levia even received one in this set in Scowling Fleshbag. It's the once per game effect that they're really hoping can disrupt your opponent, but it's still not to the same degree going to guaranteed shut down like something like Pulse Wave Harpoon can do, where they just take your blue out of your hand, take your way to turn off Blood Debt like Lost in Thought can, right? It's still not quite the same type of interaction, so there is a real weakness there in Levia, where you're basically letting your opponent play their perfect game unless you present lethal. Finally, Levia, of course, has built-in variance. We talked a little bit about this in what draw sequence looks like in Levia, but the reality is it's a card game. A lot of heroes have to deal with this. It's just that Levia is the worst at dealing with low variance because at the end of the day, she still has variance outcomes that can straight end your turn and not give you a chance to fix anything. You can see that in effects like Dread Screamer. If you miss the 3 additional banished, then what do? Your turn just kind of unexpectedly ends. And there isn't so much you can do about that because there are must plays in your deck like Art of War, Blood Rush, Doomsday, anytime you block with a non-6, which is going to be a lot of what your extra cards are because they're in your blue slot, there will be situations where even if your graveyard started out healthy, 3 hits, 2 misses, you hit the 3 hits, and then as you see the sequence of your deck, there just will be other non-6s that have to end up in your graveyard, and things can start to spiral into spots where there just is nothing you can do about potentially hitting those misses. And trust me, I've lost to this on stream many a time where there's exactly 3 misses and like 18 hits, and it just can happen. So obviously low variance outcomes there. You can also lean a bit more into variance in deck building by adding cards like Pulping or Wild Ride, which can feel really strong when drawn in the right portion of the game. Early game, they feel great. It's something to do that doesn't tax your graveyard, but in the more critical turns later in the game, they can clunk you up where you either draw multiples of them, where they are now red, non-block, 2 costs that can't pay for each other, they can't block, and they also can't turn off Blood Debt, and they're risks anyway, because if you play them and they miss on the discard, your turns just end. It's crazy how night and day Pulping can feel whether you draw it early game versus late. On top of that, of course, there is Scabskin Leathers, where you basically have a dial sitting there in a game where you can either crank up the variance or let it ride. Crank it up or let it ride. And I think most players nowadays try to just let it ride. They're not leaning into Scabskins because Levia actually can feel a lot more consistent just turn by turn now. But when you do lean into Scabskins ever, whether because your opponent just passed you a 4-card hand, and I mean, you have Gambler's Gloves up, so you're going to roll. Like, why always play in fear of the 1 in 36? Otherwise, why did you take the card? And then you still roll a 1 into a 1, and you just face that low variance outcome and just kind of lose. You don't just take Blood Debt and necessarily die now, but you actively now sacked an entire equipment piece and a 4-card hand to do nothing and just give your opponent a mountain of breathing room. It's awful. You hope that it just doesn't happen a lot, but the variance is there. On the other side of this, you could also never face these low variance scenarios and just constantly hit on Scabskins, never miss on Dread Screamer, hit every Pulping, trading reds for blues. Those outcomes can happen, but I would still peg that overall as a weakness because it's not like you actually did anything different for those outcomes to happen better this game than they did the last. You're going to make those same choices, just sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't. It is variance. So now, is Levia good based on her results? If we look at the community perception of Levia from the past 3 months, there was a lot of hype in the early months. In the first month, people were freaking out. Levia is a new A-tier deck. She's up there defining the damage numbers right next to Lexi, right next to Briar. You need to understand this hero. You need to respect this hero. Into the reality of, okay, people have played her now. People have seen kind of the ceiling of what she can do, and the reality is it's not quite what everyone thought it was. So you start to see in the second month the more realistic takes of, okay, she's more of a B tier, more of a middle of the pack type of hero where I think she legitimately should live. This is also assuming a lot of player skill to really get her up there, because if you don't play a Levia deck well, it still will look like trash. And honestly, at that point, it doesn't matter what card's in your deck, the thing just won't function. But as you get to the third month, August, deeper into national season, a calling's been played, a lot of battle hardens have played, and we're really getting everyone now focused in on what they need to prepare for nationals. You start to see the community push Levia way down, back to the almost unplayable tier, bottom of C, which I do find very surprising. Like I mentioned, I think she's healthily in the middle of the pack. She's very playable into, even if you look at the top heroes right now, Lexi, Icelander, Dromai, Briar, I'm very comfortable playing Levia into pretty much all of that. But is her game so inherently favored that someone who's not a Levia player wants to play her into that field? No, and I do agree on that point. She is still in the camp of demanding a lot of reps and know-how to put up even results. But the players who were very committed to Levia, who have put the reps in, who are known as the better Levia players in the community, are finally doing better. If you look at the previous years of Levia play, 2021 to 2022, there were 4 Nationals top 8 with Levia. There was 1 PTI event top 8 with Levia, 0 wins at this upper tier event. We're not counting ProQuest or Road to Nats, right? That's crazy. 2 years with this hero, and she was so ill-represented in the top cuts, even though there were the diehards out there still playing her. I know I was out at all these events too. Then you get to 2023 with Dusk Till Dawn. This is 3 months of Levia versus 2 years. We've already seen 6 Nationals top 8s, 2 Battle Hardened top 8s, a PTI event top 8. No win yet. No win. That's all right. But in just 3 months versus the 2 years pre-Dusk Till Dawn, you've now got double the results basically of where she was at prior. If you look at the top decks of what's going on recently with Levia builds, there's actually a lot of similarities going on, which is good and bad because it lets you look at what is very obviously a strong core of Levia cards doing really well, but it also shows that perhaps bigger experimentations are just not happening because we're in a season where the events just mean a lot more. So without having like a ProQuest season to just see what the wider community at large is doing with Levia, we do just kind of see the same cards doing well right now. And that is to say, the Mandible Claw Bloodrush core is the only thing putting up results because we're in a format where you need to be able to present damage to get over the likes of Lexi, to beat an Icelander down, to have any shot at racing a Briar. The Claws build kind of needs to happen right now. But you're also seeing Halframions make it into every list. This idea of a little splashing of recursion is still on everyone's mind, whether they're committing to a full recursion core or not. Because of people's respect for Levia, there are people who are getting smarter playing into Levia, so it demands more play with cards like Halframion to try to have outplay when your opponent is denying you Graveyard. And then finally, Art of War is making itself known as a staple 3 of now, where it used to waffle in inclusions, but now we've got Slithering Shadowpeed. It's so obviously a good card, you do want to run it these days. From Dusk Till Dawn specifically, these cards are definitely good additions. Scowling Fleshbag showing up, and like I said, really pushing the skill ceiling of how you can play Levia deck again. Grasp of Darkness, in a similar vein, is an incredible piece of equipment for the block alone, but also knowing when to use that timing. Sometimes you have multiple windows in a game where it's not just a block 2, but perhaps what you're using on top of a Rain Razors to deny a hit effect, on top of a Breaking Scales to deny a hit effect. Slithering Shadowpeed, like I said, making its way next to Art of War, and then even Hold the Line, which is a new generic that can sideboard really easily into a Levia deck because your blues you can end up blocking with a lot anyway, and now you're adding a blue that's really good first cycle, where you don't really need something like an Unworldly Bellow perhaps, because Hold the Line, you're just going to play it when you see it if it's relevant, and all of a sudden block 5 on that blue that would otherwise only block 3. Helps a bit in the mirror match, helps of course versus Lexi. Pretty cool to see a non-6 generic finally making its way into successful Levia lists. Like I said, there is more to explore in Levia because cards like Ram Raider, Diabolic Offering, Shaded Death Hydra, and Blood-Dripping Frenzy are still not quite making their mainstay appearances in these new Levia lists. They're popping up now and again, but only in supplement to a core, not replacing anything. So I guess that's a mark of good set design more than anything. They didn't obviously give us these broken cards. We're going to have to work to find out where they belong. Some older cards are waffling in and out of Levia lists as well, potentially wanting to become new core pieces of this game plan, like Pulping being the proactive graveyard fill, Savage Feast being a way to combo next to the heavy counts of Art of War as a guaranteed way to make this card enable Claws, Endless Maw as a blue that is a very strong rate of course, then Guardian of the Shadow Realm as a way to gain extra benefit post Blazafet Levia consumed, playing this out as a defense reaction. There's real roles for these cards to play in Levia lists, and it's really exciting to see older cards synergize with the newer strategies that heavier counts of Art of War, like the Demi Hero, are pushing us towards. And then this is only the surface of it, right? There's a lot of brute cards out there now. Maybe other combos are out there and we just haven't found them yet. So finally, answer the damn question, right? Is Levia good? Well, her future is actually still quite exciting. That's because Monarch was set 1 of a 3-set story arc with this Shadow and Light conflict. You had Monarch, then Dusk Till Dawn, and then according to James White when he was on the Push the Point interview, there is going to be a continuation of the story, something to do with Viscerai in set 3. So there is more to come. You assume one more Shadow set, Levia will get more support then. Is it 2 years away? Who knows? But this isn't the end-all be-all of Levia. There's always going to be the slower trickle, and then of course a guaranteed new injection of Shadow Light. Or maybe she LLs even before that and we get a whole new Levia. Wouldn't that be crazy? But right here, right now, I am going to tell you, yes, she's good. When I was grinding for Nationals as part of Team Runaways, we put serious testing, serious team resources into pushing for a Levia deck that we could function and hit the bar of a 70% win rate over at least 100 games. Idea being that after 100 games, the sample size is legitimate enough to try to push that towards a potential tournament run of, hey, a 70% win rate with a little sprinkle of luck is good enough to get you that top 8. So I was ecstatic when I pushed Levia with a 250 games played into my nationals list to a 70% win rate. Truly, I've never had consistent win rates like that with Levia. Even if the games felt like they were 70%ers going in, like I said, things could just go so wrong and the games would disappear from you. Now you had consistent ways of pushing for a win rate that was really strong, and that speaks so much to her consistency and player skill expression, and ways to play the hero where you don't just have to give up at a certain point because the deck refuses to cooperate. But yes, she's a good deck. Like we went over, she has her strengths, she has her weaknesses, and as long as you can stomach that sometimes those weaknesses are just going to rear their ugly head, and your opponents are just going to play a perfect game because you can't force them to do otherwise, and you're just going to lose a little bit of variance here or there, but you're not going to get tilted. You're going to play as tight as you possibly can, and you're going to get a little bit lucky on the day of, then she is a tournament-ready deck. I can't say factually give you the best shot of walking in and winning an event, but for all intents and purposes, however you want to define good, she is good. And I can't wait for that first big Levia win. I know it's coming soon. There's one more weekend of nationals left. You all have my blessing. I hope it's one of you. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to IntotheAM for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you in the next one.